In this lecture, we're going to take a look at some of the other structures of the heart, including the blood supply of the heart. But the first item here are the valves, which are a very important component to ensuring the flow of blood as illustrated on the previous video. So the function of these valves is to help maintain that one-way directional flow of blood, which is to say that it prevents blood from flowing backwards. And there are four valves that we see in this picture on the right hand side. Two of the valves are located between the atria and the ventricles, and recall we have one atrium on the right hand side, one ventricle on the right hand side, and an atrium and ventricle on the left hand side. And there is a valve to ensure the movement of blood from the atria into the ventricles. And so what these valves do is these valves open into the ventricles and allows blood to flow into the ventricles, thereby preventing the backflow back into the atria. So the two atrioventricular valves are referred to as the mitral valve, which is by definition a bicuspid valve, and it has two cusps to it. And this is the one on the left-hand side between the left atrium and the left ventricle. The tricuspid valve is located on the right side of the heart between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Now we also have two valves between the ventricles and the major vessels that leave those ventricles. The aortic semilunar valve is the valve between the left ventricle and the major vessel leaving the left ventricle, which is the aorta. The pulmonary semilunar valve is located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. So these two valves function in the same manner as the two atrioventricular valves, is that these two valves here will open into the aorta or the pulmonary trunk and will close, preventing blood from flowing back into the ventricles. The papillary muscles, which we'll see on the next slide, are extensions of the muscle tissue making up the ventricular wall, and these papillary muscles essentially pulls the valves into, or the leaflets of the valves, pulls the valves towards the ventricles, and in doing so it will actually prevent the valves from, the leaflets from flipping back up into the atria. The chordae tendineae are the connective tissue tendons, if you will, that connect the papillary muscles to the valves, particularly the atrioventricular valves, or just simply summarized as the AV valves. And so on this picture on the right here, we see the mitral valve on the left hand side, and it has two cusps. The three cusps make up the tricuspid valve, and these are two AV valves. The valves here have three components, both the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. So the aorta is the major vessel leaving the left ventricle, and once again, blood leaving the left ventricle is oxygenated blood, and that goes out to serving the heart and the rest of the body. The pulmonary valve extends from the right ventricle, and this is the pulmonary trunk is the major vessel leaving the right ventricle, and that's deoxygenated blood going to the lungs, and the valve regulates the exit of that blood out of that chamber. Connecting the valves, we see what's called a fibrous skeleton, and that fibrous skeleton is made up of connective tissue that helps to provide structure to the heart. So in this picture here, we're going to take a look at the right side of the heart, and so we start once again with blood entry into the heart from the superior vena cava, and this is blood returning to the heart that is blood coming from the upper extremity and the head and neck. The inferior vena cava is blood that is returning back to the heart for tissues inferior to the heart. So that blood will enter the right atrium and will then move into the right ventricle. And you can see here that the tricuspid valve opens into the ventricle, and then when this ventricle contracts, this valve will close. But because it's soft tissue, the valve does not flip back up into the right atrium because of these papillary muscles that we'll define here on the right hand side. So that blood will leave the right ventricle through what's called the pulmonary trunk, and the pulmonary trunk divides into the pulmonary arteries. And the pulmonary valve is located between the right atrium and the pulmonary trunk, so that blood, when it leaves the right ventricle, continues to exit but does not spill back into the right ventricle when this valve closes. The trabeculae carnae is a reference to the myocardium inside the ventricles that has these ridge-like appearances, but this is myocardial tissue. The chordae tendineae are the tendon extensions that connect the valve leaflets to the extensions of the myocardium called the papillary muscles. So when the ventricles contract, the papillary muscles will also contract and will not open the valve, but will prevent the valve from flipping back up into the atria, both on the right hand side and the left hand side. What we see here with the left heart, we have blood returning from the lungs back into the left side of the heart through the right pulmonary veins and the left pulmonary veins. Now, this is an important point to note that in the body, in the human body, veins transport deoxygenated blood that has relatively less oxygen, with the exception of the pulmonary veins. So all veins carry deoxygenated blood except for the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins are the only veins that transport oxygenated blood, and this is blood coming from the lungs. And so these veins will enter the left side of the heart into the left atrium. That blood will enter the left ventricle, and just like we saw with the right side of the heart, the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve will regulate the blood flow into that ventricle and prevent the backflow of blood into the left atrium. So what we see here, it's hard to see right here, but what we have is an aortic valve. So this arrow is actually pointing to the aortic valve between the left ventricle and the major arterial organ called the aorta. And so this valve here prevents the backflow of blood. And so just two last labels here, once again making reference to this relatively thick myocardium and of course the septum separating the right ventricle from the left ventricle. In this slide, we're just going to take a look at some of the major vessels of the coronary circulation. So once again here, as mentioned in an earlier lecture, it's very important that the heart tissue is supplied with oxygen, and that oxygen is provided through the blood. And so what we see here is that when blood leaves the left ventricle at the base of the aorta, kind of hard to see here, but you see the silhouette images of the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery branching off of the base of the aorta, which sits behind the pulmonary trunk. And the left coronary artery and right coronary artery further branches into a number of other arteries. So on the right hand side, we have what's called the right marginal artery, the posterior interventricular artery, and on the left hand side we have what's called the circumflex artery and the anterior interventricular artery. And these blood vessels will supply oxygen and other nutrients to all of the tissues of the heart. Now, those cells will engage in metabolism and produce metabolic end products, including carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide enters the blood after oxygen, a sufficient amount of oxygen, has been removed to meet the needs of the tissues. And that deoxygenated blood will return eventually back to the right atrium through the anterior cardiac veins. We see that we have branches through what's called the great cardiac vein, and we have a major vein of the coronary circulation called the coronary sinus, and this serves as a reservoir, if you will, and allowing blood to momentarily collect on its way back to the right atrium. And we see that we have other veins that will drain blood from the ventricles, called the small cardiac vein and the middle cardiac vein. So this ends this portion of our Part 1 lecture on the cardiovascular